All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, May 16th, and we just had the big Istanbul meeting yesterday. What happened?
Yeah, well, actually, it didn't really happen until today, is my
Hmm.
understanding. It was supposed to happen yesterday, and the Russians. What happened is that the Russian team, which had been the members of which were officially announced, I think, the day before, and it's a considerable. We don't have Putin, of course, and Lavrov, but you have a deputy foreign minister, a deputy defense minister, the head of the GRU. So it's a formidable team. It wasn't like they were just sending um, low-level functionaries. Clearly, this is the team you send if you are serious about negotiating. They sent it, but they arrived yesterday morning, and originally the meeting was supposed to begin at 10, and then I said, well, maybe at 2, and then it was like 5 or 6 in the evening there in Istanbul, and said, well, we don't know really what's going on. Uh, the Ukrainians flew off not to Istanbul but to Ankara, which is quite a distance away, the capital of Turkey, and met with Erdogan, who, by the way, said that, yeah, he supported like full recovery of the territories, including Crimea. But, that's Erdogan. And eventually the Ukrainians made it to Istanbul, and the meeting was held today. It actually concluded, I think, about an hour or two ago.
Okay, do we know what was discussed?
Well, we don't know all the details. We've got well, the first reports came from the Ukrainian side, and they said that the Russians had these very unrealistic demands that went far beyond anything that they had said before. That, in other words, they demanded the four territories, the four oblasts, and we're talking about Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, and the way it was reported is that was outrageous and it was a surprise even. And of course, it shouldn't be a surprise. It was something that um, Putin actually stated, very clearly back in June of last year, and has been repeating, and other Russian officials have been repeating ever since. So it's clear that the Russians actually didn't budge. They presented the demands that we were all aware of, and they actually added a little something, which was the buffer zone in Sumy, opposite of Kursk. Um, so that's actually additional. Now, I have the feeling that that's maybe something they can bargain on. I think typically when you go into negotiations, you actually start a little bit. At least you have something you can bargain away. So maybe they could bargain that away. But I think the others they made clear is that these are um, basic demands. These are not uh, um, points that they can really be substantively flexible about. That these oblasts are Russian territory, and they cannot surrender them. Um, there are some stories actually that appeared in Ukrainian media that said, when the Russians said that we want these four oblasts, and the Ukrainians said no way. He said, well, if you don't accept this, it's going to be five next time. And again, according to some reports, the fifth one that they were talking about is Dnipropetrovsk, um, which they're only something like less than a half a mile from. They're approaching, actually, in several points, coming very, very close to that boundary. So it may be that, in fact, the Russians were careful not to cross it, before they actually mentioned that this is going to be next. Um, and then, according to again, to Ukrainian media, um, yeah, it was actually the Russians stood up and said, if you don't accept our demand on the four oblasts, there's going to be a fifth, and then they walked out of the room. Now, I don't know that actually happened, but that's how it was reported in some Ukrainian media. But there was one substantive, real result from this negotiation, and that was the exchange of 1,000 prisoners on each side. Actually, the Ukrainians had gone in, according to some reports, they were going to demand an immediate ceasefire and 8,000. There are 8,000 prisoners because, the Russians are holding a lot more Ukrainian prisoners of war than the other way around. In fact, the Ukrainians have, I think, not much more than 1,000. So basically, the Ukrainians have agreed to give all their prisoners of war, or nearly all of them, to the Russians in exchange for 1,000 on the other side.
Okay. So do you believe that this negotiation, these talks in Istanbul, was this a big nothing burger, or should we view it as a positive step?
Well, I think it has to be considered a positive step, um, or potentially a positive step. I think it is good, to maintain channels of communication. Uh, even between warring enemies, or maybe especially between warring enemies. And maybe right now, I don't think there's any way that a settlement will be reached. Again, the two sides are just way too far apart. But over time, that may change. And I think it's important for the Ukrainians to understand to what the Russian positions, the Russian demands are. You almost got the sense that they were, again, according, maybe it was just the media, but the way the Ukrainians have been talking, they talk real tough, like, yeah, it's just like the Europeans, like, the Russians are on the verge of collapse. They'll give in, they'll agree to the ceasefire or whatever. Um, and the Russians have been saying, like we said, no, we are demanding at the very least, at this point, we're demanding, these 4 regions. And we're not budging on that. And they've said it again and again. But it's almost like they didn't, the Europeans weren't hearing it. Most of the Americans, the way that Kellogg, the U.S. peace envoy, is, it seems like he just never heard it. The one person who really understood it is, of course, Witkoff, because he spoke to Putin personally. Now, like, because of the news sources that we go to, we've known about this for a long time. But I think a lot of those guys just don't even know. If they really depend on mainstream sources, and these sort of things, what the Russians say, are rarely, if ever, reported. Or if they're reported, it's always in such a kind of distorted fashion that you don't really know what they're saying. So, Witkoff went and heard it directly from Putin. And so he came back and said, oh, yeah, I think maybe we got to give them those 4 regions in addition to Crimea. But the others just don't seem to be aware of. And you're thinking, well, the Ukrainians have got to know, right? Of course.
Right.
I would, you kind of wonder, though. It's just that maybe just as the West has become a victim of its own narrative, of its own PR war, perhaps the Ukrainians to some extent have too. They've invested so much emotionally in this certain narrative, and they've actually been very good at it, I think especially in the early part of the war. It seems to me they're kind of faltering now, but that, yeah, maybe they to some extent start to believe in their own narrative. That's the way they always talk. Of course, the reality is very different, and they are losing. And I think we have to keep in mind that appears to be a major offensive, right there on the horizon. And they don't talk like like people who are in that position, who are faced with that reality. They still seem to be invested and seem to actually believe in this narrative. It's rather hard to explain. I mean, there are ways to explain it, but it's irrational for various reasons.
Yeah, I find it difficult to believe, but I mean, maybe you're right. Just to think that this is one of the most, if it's your job as a negotiator, or if you're Kellogg as this envoy, you should be doing all the research possible, before this. It's not like this information is hidden. You should be able to go directly to the source itself. I mean, and the Ukrainians, they could just be looking at Russian media. It's not like that they're, Russia's holding its cards close to its chest. It's quite the opposite. They're saying over and over again what their demands are, what's not negotiable. So yeah, you really think that they just,
yeah,
they just
I'm
don't
not
look?
sure. It's just like the thought dawned on me, when I started, like, Because I think it really is true of people like Kellogg. We've been following these people for a long time. And I think um, they rely on these certain sources, mainstream for a good part, of the U.S. population. These are rock solid, and they're just telling it how it is, and this is the objective truth. And you would hope that somebody like Kellogg would get briefed, but then we've talked about the corruption of the intelligence agencies, and a lot of the people at the top, say what the boss wants to hear because it actually helps their own careers and whatever. Or, maybe something gets through, but it just contradicts everything else that he's heard and believes in, and he ignores it. So I think there's no question a lot of the Europeans and and Americans really, have come to believe their own propaganda. And actually, it should be pointed out that their own propaganda is to a great extent Ukrainian propaganda. They take what the Ukrainians tell them and just pass it on, Now, yeah, in the case of Ukraine, again, like they can understand, Russian. Most of them are even the leadership is basically I've heard this many times that, when they discuss matters among themselves, they speak in Russian. They know what the Russians are saying. You would think, but I wonder if just like the success of their own propaganda, they hear it coming back from the Europeans and the Americans. Oh, Russia's on the verge of collapse. Russia's going to cave in on this. And they say, well, these guys got to know what they're talking about. I was kind of wondering about it. And the Russians, we all know they're liars. We can't pay attention to them. And so, maybe to some extent, I don't know. It's speculation on my part. Maybe to some extent, They have come to believe their own propaganda.
Do you think this is a result of just a broken and corrupt intelligence department and systems that the U.S. and the West run? That it is about propaganda, and then you think that we have this huge infrastructure for intelligence that we employ tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of billions of dollars that go and do all these programs. But then what comes out at the end of the day that feeds the decision makers appears to be garbage. So what's the point of they would do way better if they just listened to the Duran Daily or something like this,
Yeah, no, well, I've noticed this, I've been, I think you can see, the corruption goes way back. One thing, Larry Johnson was in the CIA, and he talks about, he observed decisions on like intelligence reports that were obviously political. They weren't fact-based. And, so people were actually lying to their superiors because they knew what their superiors wanted. And it was, the problem too is the superiors. They get mad when they get the wrong kind of intelligence report because that didn't help them with their superiors or whatever. So, you could see that even back then. And I think the problem is just that was way back in the 1980s. But I think it's gotten much, much worse over time. Again, this is what I hear from people like Larry Johnson, who they still has connections with the intelligence communities. And, otherwise, how do you explain it? How do you explain, it would help to explain a lot of the very bad decisions that have been made.
Yeah. So it sounds like maybe our intelligence agencies are more propaganda agencies, and they're spouting out propaganda even to our own people, and we're falling victim to our own propaganda. Right. That's what it is, right?
Yeah, I think there's no question about it. And again, that's a problem going way back. It's a problem that's only gotten worse over time. There's no question about it. We've
fallen victim to our own intelligence, which isn't intelligence. It's actually propaganda.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the one thing that you did say that about the prisoner exchange, 1,000 prisoners on each side, that is very promising, right? That shows that they actually were able to accomplish something. There's an agreement. So do we know that if the channel of communication after these talks will remain open?
Well, that's another, that's been reported by both sides, by both the Russians and the Ukrainians, that they are expecting to have. I don't think, a date has been set, a time has been set, but they're expecting to have further negotiations. And it might even be tomorrow in Istanbul. So that's a positive sign. There is also, one of the things that the Russians agreed to consider was a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. I think the Russians probably don't see much value in that, and I think they're right. Again, they're so far apart. What's this all about? I think they understand that it's theater basically, but they may decide, well, okay, I guess we've got to play this game. So that just might happen.
Mm,
I know that you
yeah.
mentioned the possibility early. You thought that it would be smart of Putin to actually kind of call his bluff.
I don't know if it'll be smart, but I don't see it working out for Zelensky the way he's thinking it will work out. I mean, it's going to make this is something that like people like Trump and Zelensky love. Prime time television. The big meeting. It probably won't be anything substantive coming out of it, but I think it wouldn't hurt, right? It's just a good sign for me as long as the dialogue is happening. And what I was afraid of was that it looked bad from my understanding with these Istanbul talks. First, like you said, it was delayed. The Zelensky went to Ankara instead of Istanbul, and you're wondering what's going on. And then I saw something on Twitter where they said that the Ukrainian delegation, you can see there's a picture of Zelensky there too at the end of the table with the Russian counterparts, and they were using interpreters from Ukrainian into Russian, is that they had an official interpreter. At least that's what I saw. I don't know if that's been verified. I just saw that online. I'm like, if that's the case, then this isn't real. These are just children here playing this stupid game when you know that Zelensky speaks much better Russian than he does Ukrainian, and he's insisting on using an interpreter from Ukrainian into Russian. If I was sitting across from them, I'd be like, "What are you doing, man?" Like,
yeah. Well, Zelensky wasn't actually part of the negotiating team. He wasn't in the rooms.
Okay, so the picture I saw online was completely wrong.
So I heard that the negotiations were conducted in Russian. I think that's how it was reported afterwards. Zelensky went on to Albania, where there's some kind of EU meeting or something. I'm not sure exactly what it is. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. You look at how many times Zelensky has contradicted himself and changed his position this week. It's really quite remarkable. From ceasefire or nothing. The sanctions are going to go into effect. That's what he and the Europeans were saying, I think, like at the end of the day on Tuesday, I think it was. And, here we are, the sanctions still haven't gone into effect. I'm not going to Ankara. Okay, I'm going to Ankara, but Putin better be there. Okay, well, maybe he doesn't have to be there, but I'm going to go off to Albania. I don't know what's going on. Well, he doesn't know what he's doing. He really doesn't. I think part of the problem is that Trump kept on pulling the rug out from under him. They thought that they had Trump on their team, that they had roped him into this thing. Okay, we say this, and then we give him 24 hours. And Trump said, that's a great idea. Let's go talk. And then, Zelensky said, no, I can't, we're not going. And then Trump said, apparently, the Americans told him, you better go. And they said, okay, we're going. Okay, I'm going, but Putin better be there. So, this is it. He just didn't get the support that he expected to get. And so he kept on having to backtrack.
Okay. Well, hopefully these lines of communication stay open. And if there is an imminent Russian offensive, do you think there's some chance that when it happens, if they're still talking, they'll be like, whoa, okay, let's settle this now? Or do you think that an idea of negotiates up?
Yeah, I think they're still too far away. It may, maybe a year from now or something, after even more territory. I'm afraid that's the way it is.
Another year or?
Yeah, I just don't see it. Again, it's just everything about the Ukrainians at this point. I just don't see them changing because they are so adamant and they have been just so virulent, in their attacks on Russia and really so delusional in their demands too, that I can't see them doing that in the near future. I don't think it's at all possible. But, maybe eventually as the Ukraine just starts to truly collapse, things might begin to change. There might be, there could be a coup within Ukraine and that which could make things worse, but potentially could make things better. We just don't know. At the present time, I don't see it happening. But I think it's still, in any case, it is good to maintain channels of communication. Maybe the settlement is maybe never happen, seems very unlikely, but at least it makes it increases the possibility. Maybe it's from a very low level, but having those lines of communication open is good. One thing I just wanted to add, I think, this is a lot of people see this as like all show on the part of, well, certainly on the Ukrainian side, but also the Russian side. And I think there's, a large element of that. It's just like the Russians understand they need to play this game. And it's a game that's, maybe the main audience or spectator to this theater that we're observing is Trump. I think that's the main one. It's just that, I think both sides want him to blame the other side. And so they have to show good faith efforts. I think that's a big part of what's going on, but it's not all that's going on. Again, on the Russian side, in fact, this was not just a response to that ultimatum delivered by Kiev and the Europeans, namely a ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire, unconditional, or we slap new sanctions on you, immediately. It did. I think that sped up his response and kind of focused his response. But apparently, he had been telling the world leaders, those that attended the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, he had been telling them, "Yeah, we're planning to meet with the Ukrainians, for negotiations." And so this was something that they had planned, some time back. And I think it partly is just to reassure, convince, to demonstrate to, their many friends and allies, and all those neutral countries too, that okay, yeah, Russia is serious. We're not closing down avenues to negotiation. We are looking for some kind of settlement. I think it's Putin's always understand the importance of his of these relations with the global majority. But I think there's a third thing, which I haven't heard other people say. I think it's in kind of Putin's character that before he like launches a major escalation or it would be an offensive in this case, he provides an off ramp to the enemy. I mean, we saw him do that like prior to the SMO. Where, you could say that went on for a long time. He kept on hoping that Minsk would work and he made different offers. And then it became clear that Minsk, that the other side wasn't serious at all, that Minsk had collapsed. And so then he sent Lavrov off to the different capitals and saying, look, we have a serious problem here. These are our demands. And he said, we need a new security architecture for Europe. And he laid it all out, made it real clear, spoke with Biden, spoke with these other, Putin spoke directly with Biden, I think it was in December, and then earlier in the year 2021. And then Lavrov, of course, visited with many and just presented, this is what we need. We got to do this. And of course, it was rejected. And then we had the SMO. Now, I remember when Putin set out his demands, and which included the 4 regions. When he set that out, and I think it was June 14th of last year, I remember thinking, he's providing the off ramp. There's going to be some kind of offensive. Now we're here almost a year later, but I think that we are going to see it. And then, I think it's important to Putin himself. It's just like he said, well, I did, I actually looked for another way. I did give them an alternative. And, and now, I ticked that box, more than ticked it, like he spent a year telling people and talking to people about it. And now, and then in very dramatic fashion, had a negotiating team go to Istanbul and restate it again to the Ukrainians themselves. The Ukrainian, that was a very high level delegation. They had their defense minister. I think also was it the head of the SBU there? But anyway, it was even kind of higher ranks than the Russians had. So they heard it, directly from the Russians. And so now, when he goes on and takes Dnipropetrovsk, for example, they say, well, look, we really, really told you, you knew it. And and then it's going to be something else down the road. I think that's the way Putin operates.
Yeah, I think that, that makes sense. It lines up But the problem is, it's just this sunk cost fallacy with Ukraine.
Yeah,
Each time they reject one of these deals and then they lose more, they just can't. They just feel like they can't. They have to get it all back. They lost so much. They could have
right.
had it all. They could have
Yeah,
had all those four op loss at the beginning. Now they're going
right.
to
With the
lose
Minsk
these four.
Accords, right.
Yeah, and I just think with Zelensky and the current administration in Kiev, they they have to be removed because they can't survive themselves. Just like to tell their country, like all those people that died, 1 million Ukrainians potentially, for what? For nothing, and then they lose half their country. They truly died in vain, and that's just
Right.
such a tough pill to
Yeah,
swallow. I
right.
don't think it's possible. So the only way to change it then would be to you have to remove Zelensky. You have to get rid of the Banderites in power. But and then they may make up a minority of the population. But like you said, if they have the guns, they can stay in power for a long time.
Right.
Um,
And the thing is that I think they really have shaped the discourse, um, they have influenced the thinking. Ukrainian nationalism, ultranationalism was a very, very fringe phenomenon, and it no longer is. Since they've taken power, they have made it mainstream. I don't know how deep it goes in different parts of the country. Maybe a lot of it just has to do with fear, and maybe it's clear that their power is waning. A lot of people will say, I never really believed in that. We'll have to see. But yeah, what you say is right. It's just, and this is not just true of this war. It's true of all wars. It's the losing side can find it very, very difficult, even when it's very much in their own interest to say, okay, yeah, we're losing. We just have to accept this and swallow this bitter pill. Otherwise, we're going to lose more. And some leaderships in some wars are able to do that. But there are times, especially, yeah, where that becomes a pill that's just too bitter to swallow for them, and they just continue to fight, even though rationally it's going to lead to their destruction. But the alternative of admitting what they did and how much they lost is just too much.
yeah, it's really sad state of affairs. And the thing that's scary is as Russia continues to grind down Ukraine, then the Banderites, Zelensky, are going to get increasingly desperate, increasingly more dangerous. If they're not able to win this, where they start to engage in asymmetrical warfare, which is essentially terrorism more and
Yeah.
more. I don't know how this is going to end, Dad. I mean, like, because even if they take Dnipropetrovsk, then it's like, what next? It's the more territory that you take, that Russia takes, the further west they go, the more insurgency problems they'll start to encounter as they
Uh-huh.
enter into Banderite territory.
Right.
They don't want to be there, but
Yeah.
but they can't, if they just stop, then they're just on a border with essentially a terrorist state that is hell bent on killing Russians. And they've suffered so much. Everybody that's left in Ukraine probably knows multiple people that have died in this war. And they'll blame Russia for it. The Russians killed them in this war, and there's just gonna be so much bad blood. I don't know. It could just be a quagmire for decades,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah. No, you're right. It's just going to be kind of an ugly suppurating wound for a long time. I think there's no question about it, and there just doesn't seem to be. Again, um, to quote John Mearsheimer, the Russians will win. The Russian victory is inevitable, but it will be an ugly victory. I think that's the truth. Yeah,
I think the one potential solution for Ukraine is that in this dialogue, if they continue to communicate with the Russians, and it gets to a point where there has to be some type of agreement that's reached, you have to play this blame game. Where it's like Ukraine suffered so much, it can't be just all our fault. Well, whose fault is it? It's America's fault. It's NATO's fault. And if they are able to come to that conclusion collectively, because in a huge respect, it's true. I mean, there's obviously blame all around. Russia did invade. Ukraine did make its decisions. But a big part of this war would never have happened if it wasn't for the United States and the promises of NATO. Like, this is really one of the key things. So if they understand that and they realize, like, hey, we were used by the West, this was the West's fault, then you could maybe have some healing between that. Of course, it probably won't be great for Western Europe, but I think it would be okay because Putin has shown himself to be not a vindictive person. He doesn't seem to be some cool and rational. He understands great power politics, so he doesn't want to punish America necessarily for this. He's actually been very hospitable. I would have been super scared to go and talk. It's like, sorry, we've been helping kill Russians via the Ukrainians for a long time. Can we go talk to you and pretend to be friends? Like that's awkward.
Right.
But Putin's like, sure, we can talk. So that could be the best outcome. Is that if we could frame this correctly, where Ukraine and Russia say, it's not your fault, Ukraine, it's America's fault, it's NATO's fault, and then they say, yeah, you're right, it's true. Let's make up.
Yeah, well, the Ukrainians themselves are going to have to come to that conclusion, and it's not impossible. Again, especially if Ukraine really starts to fall apart and it becomes clear. I think you still have a number of Ukrainians that somehow believe in their government and that they can, snatch victory from the jaws of defeat here. I think there's still too many Ukrainians that believe that, but there will be a point where if you're not just completely, if you haven't gone completely off the deep end, you're going to see the truth, and you're going to understand that, yeah, we've lost this, and that NATO and the U.S., the firm promises they made to us, well, they weren't able to keep them, and we were fools to believe in them, and they did not do well by us. They should not, if they made promises that they couldn't keep, they shouldn't have made them. Maybe that'll dawn on them at some point.
Right. Because you hear this rhetoric that comes out of our politicians when they're speaking with Ukrainians. Just I heard on the Judge Knapp show, just like Lindsey Graham talking like, I'm so proud of you. You make me like, this is like how we were, fight for freedom. Like just all these promises, like, we were really behind you 100%. That's just a small example, but you got
that happens every day, really.
Every day, right? Every day they're being told that, and nothing comes out of it. Just more and more Ukrainians die. The Europeans can't do anything, and I think Zelensky has to be getting frustrated, right? What is Zelensky's plan? He is just falling back on these promises, and he feels good because he flies around and gets hugs and kisses from Macron and Keir Starmer, and like that makes him think that he still is in the fight.
Yeah, no, it's absurd. I mean, I think it was just the other day that Macron himself, admitted that they don't have anything left to give the Ukrainians. He said, we gave them a lot, but you can't give them what you don't have. In other words, their stockpiles have been drawn all the way down, and it's true of really all the European countries. That's where they are. So all this tough talk is just hot air. But they have a plan. They're going to invest $800 billion or whatever. And that's like a lot of EU plans, and it'll go nowhere. Yeah, no, it's amazing. I mean, they should be seeing it. He seems to have trouble believing it. It's just like, again, I think this faith in the West, the almighty West, is hard to. It's deeply embedded in the psyches of many people around the world. And it's really hard for people to give up on that. And I think maybe that's part of what we're seeing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, especially Russia has always been kind of the brunt of jokes since the 90s, is this sort of, poor, broken nation with mail order brides, this gas station, masquerading as a country. And it's like, that can't be possible against the mighty West with a much larger GDP, much larger population, NATO, the greatest fighting force in the world. They're out of weapons. It's unbelievable.
Yeah,
it's
hard to believe. What they're saying themselves.
Yeah.
Right. And then again, like Mark Rutte was saying, I just saw that clip again, I think last night, is that, they're out. They can, in 3 months, they can produce what, it takes us a whole year to produce. In other words, Russia is outproduced. He's talking about just, all of NATO, including the U.S. So that's a 4-to-1 ratio.
Right. So Zelensky is basically just praying that somehow everything he's been learning about the military power of NATO in the West is just a bad dream, and he'll wake up one day and it's like all of a sudden super weapons start flowing and troops come in, and all of a sudden NATO just
Yeah.
marches into Ukraine. Is that his plan? It's just a black swan event
Yeah,
plan.
well, I think that's he's hoping for some kind of black swan event. I mean, it just you can't see anything realistically. There's just again this. Um, I don't. I think it's a mistake to. I don't know what's going on in his head. I think he may very well be drug addled but or just emotionally, psychically broken by the experiences of the last few years. Again, here's a guy who went in as a peace candidate, who was a Russian speaker. Um, I think he may have even, maybe I'm wrong. Was it that he actually may have grown up in Dnipropetrovsk? But
I don't know.
yeah, it's sort of kind of central Ukraine. That's still Eastern Ukraine. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I think maybe probably he was a little farther west. Um, but anyway, yeah, he's a Russian speaker. All his comedies, successful comedies, were done in Russian, and he actually was a peace candidate. He was going to make good on the Minsk Accords, and then when he got in power, he just learned what the reality was, and could either stand by his principles and face possible death. I mean, these are some very scary people. That were opposed to implementation of the Minsk Accords, or he could capitulate. And I think he did, and he's really become one of them. And that's what we've seen. It's a process that's ongoing in Ukraine. It's again the extremists have gradually taken part of the country, and so yeah, I think he's a lost cause. He's just not coming in a way coming back. I think he's there's no way for him to abandon his delusions. And in any case, I think he would, if he started to, he would fear for his life.
And that's why you don't do drugs, kids.
Yeah.
It's bad stuff. Okay, well let's move over to the Middle East a bit. So Trump is concluded. I guess he's done with his Middle East tour now, and I've been seeing some big headlines of securing these massive deals, $1.2 trillion with Qatar, I guess I should say. Um, and these numbers are massive. But then I just realized, what does that mean? I
Yeah.
hear these big numbers thrown around all the time on these headlines. Or $800 billion investment fund with this, 1 trillion. But is this something Americans should be excited about? Is this something that will actually help energize the U.S. economy, or is this just another grift
Right.
where it's going to be lining the pockets of defense industries and whatever?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know exactly what the details. I don't know what the details of these investment plans are, where that money is going. I know that in the case of Qatar, it's over 10 years. So it's, $120 billion a year, which is considerable. That's if that indeed happens. But, often these end up being, these figures are inflated. And then over, a period of 10 years, well, it gives Qatar an opportunity maybe to wiggle out of it, maybe inflation will eat into it. I don't know, but you can't deny that those are good headlines for Trump. I mean, I
Right.
think he came back with something, and no matter what, even if it turns out not to be, even half of what they're saying, it's a lot. It's something considerable. Um, Yeah, it was, I think, Trump doing what he likes doing best. We talked about that last time, and he's got to be feeling good about himself and yeah, feeling like for once, things really went his way. And I think it was clear, like these Gulf monarchies, they understand Trump. They probably seem to understand him better than just about anybody, and they knew what would make him really happy.
Yeah.
Especially that 747. And yes, it's not that they are shifting their policy. It's just part of, I think, all of those Gulf monarchies have decided that, yeah, we don't want to break relations with the Americans. We want to, stay in their good graces to the extent possible. But they all of them have made obvious, are building bridges with the rest of the world and are diversifying. They understand that, that just having an let's say, a U.S.-centric foreign policy is not wise at this time. They are not putting all their eggs in the American basket, but they are improving relations with China and Russia and other countries in the world, and burying the hatchet with Iran. So yeah, they are. I think these are people that understand diplomacy. And they understand the people that they're working with, and they probably, I'm sure. Yeah, they. For example, that 747, that cost them something. But I'm sure that these investments are being done in a way where they feel they're going to get back a lot of it, on a purely business level. And then there's the political aspect to it too. They looked at it, they made the calculations, and they decided that this was a smart move.
Right. No, the Gulf monarchies, they nailed it with Trump. They knew exactly what he wanted, and you could see it on his face. He was just really happy, enjoyed it. His speeches, like the processions, the reception. He was talking about, look at all these camels. I haven't seen camels this beautiful in a long time. Look at this construction. It's funny the way he talks, but they understood him, and they played it, I think, just right. So I think he has a warm, fuzzy feeling when it comes to Mohammed bin Salman. And the Qataris and the United Arab Emirates, whereas his relationship with Israel Netanyahu has truly soured. So it's kind of interesting to see. I think he enjoys hanging out with the Arab countries more than he does Israel, and I wonder how substantial that is, how pivotal that is. And do you think that in his talks with the Gulf monarchies that Israel and Gaza came up?
I don't know. I think again, it's like these governments, of course, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE. They have made it clear that they cannot cannot normalize relations with Israel at this point. I think it was something they were considering prior to October 7th, but it's just like the horror of what's happened just makes it impossible for them. And so that's just not going to happen. And if he brought it up, I think they probably just restated that this is not going to happen. Now, I would say with these people, is this going to affect Trump's relationship with Israel? The fact that he's got a good relationship with the Gulf monarchies. I don't know if it'll really affect it that much because, though they will not normalize relations with Israel, neither are they going to be part of the resistance. They really haven't done anything to help their brothers in Palestine. I mean, that's the sad truth. And they're going to say things or whatever just to mollify their own people who they know are angry. But they're not. I don't think they're going to do anything substantive. They're not going to push, Trump in any. In a really meaningful direction. They're going to tolerate. They're tolerating the genocide, and they will continue to tolerate it.
Yeah, using the term genocide, I felt like even 6 months ago was a bit more contentious. But now it's getting to the point where I think more and more people are willing to say that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, especially with all those reports of starvations. And I think we're seeing just a general shift, definitely in global perception, but also even within mainstream media. Just right before we started the podcast, I just grabbed a couple of headlines from the past 24 hours regarding Gaza. And I'll just read them to you. The Guardian says, Trump says people in Gaza are starving and U.S. will take care of the situation. Reuters headline was deadly Israeli strikes pound Gaza as Trump says people are starving. The New York Times has the headline, Trump says people are starving in Gaza. The U.S. wants to help. CBS News, Trump says a lot of people are starving in Gaza as death toll from Israelis assault hits over 53,000. NBC News, accused of making starvation a bargaining chip, Israel launches another wave of strikes on Gaza. So these are all mainstream media news, and the fact that they're talking about the starvation problem, the starvation issue, you can't really hide this, right? This is genocide if you're starving a whole civilian population, a whole population. I don't know how they can get around, they can't spin this. And even people, I just saw right before we started, I just saw Piers Morgan tweet. And if you followed Piers Morgan since October 7th, every single time he had a guest on that would be talking about the Palestinian cause, he would always be like, but do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? It was all the fault of Hamas, focused on the October 7th atrocities. But he has shifted over this period of time, and he tweeted, another day, another massacre in Gaza this morning. This cannot go on. Netanyahu is out of control and must be stopped. And, there's a footage headline of Israelis bombing a hospital, 250 people killed or something like this. So, yeah, I just think that you can't keep defending this. It's becoming increasingly difficult for mainstream media, for anybody to defend this, and saying that criticizing it makes you an anti-Semite. People aren't afraid of that label so much anymore. What do you think about that? Do you think that we've kind of passed that line where we can just say truthfully?
Well, yeah, I think we are, crossing a threshold. Again, I think I pointed out that in a recent program anyway, that we had some major, lifelong ardent Zionists actually turning on the Netanyahu government. Now, they haven't abandoned their Zionism, but they have, they are pointing to Netanyahu as a war criminal, essentially. Recently, Joseph Borrell, the former, foreign policy chief of the EU, has said pretty much the same thing. So, yeah, one thing is just that, right, it just can't be hidden, especially the starvation, because the Israelis themselves haven't denied it. They're not saying that, Hamas we're trying to provide these supplies to the poor people of Gaza, but Hamas is stealing it or something. No, the Israelis themselves stated, no more humanitarian aid. And they stated that, 2 months or more, longer ago. And so who's doing it. And it just can't be, it just can't be hidden. And I mean, it just is just plain as day. It's amazing. Again, we are starting to get criticisms, but it should be much. Remember, this country is starving these people to death. Right now, I think it was just a week ago, in fact, that I heard 60,000 malnourished children have been hospitalized because of malnutrition. That shows you where we are. And, many of those are going blind. And, as a result of the malnutrition, they're going to suffer permanent damage. They say, permanent brain damage and other, physical damage, even if they are saved. Now, this is what they've done. And there's no question that they did it. They themselves, again, you have Smotrich being very open about Israel's genocidal intent here. You say, yeah, we're going to get rid of them. We kill them or we drive them out. That's what they're saying. That's the thing. It's just that there used to be a pretense, and they used to work very hard to spin these things. They don't work very hard. So it's sort of like they go each time they bomb a hospital now. It's just like, this was a precision strike and Hamas was hiding there. And then it's later shown that was pure BS. But they would really fight it. Remember that first hospital they hit? It was just like all the Hasbara guns were firing. It's just like they kept on coming back, trying to, spin until your head just was, you didn't know left from right, and you say, well, it's complicated. But now they barely try. They barely try, and they're not hiding it. It just seems to be. And that is having repercussions. We have a ways to go, but I think we are seeing some real progress. It really is getting through to some of these long-term supporters of Israel. It's getting through to them that something's terribly wrong. They don't. I think it's very, very hard as somebody who's, again, emotionally invested in Israel, like a Jewish Zionist or a Christian Zionist or any serious Zionist. There's a deep emotional investment in Israel, and it's hard. That becomes part of who you are, and to just let that go it's very difficult. It's very hard for people to do that kind of thing. So what I think we see the first stages of it is where we have this man, Netanyahu, who is corrupting, pure Zionism or something, and we must get rid of him. I think some of them are arguing that. Some of them are, obviously are going to go beyond that and realize, that there's a deeper problem. Um, but that, though that's an incomplete recognition, it is a real recognition. And I think it's important, again, especially when we look at the kind of people like Thomas Friedman, that are now voicing these. You thought, I didn't think I would ever hear Thomas Friedman say the things that he's saying right now. But I think the evidence is just so overpowering, especially now. You're just starving and it's gone for 2 months. How much can you spend this? At some point, it's just like, I'm all out of spend. You're just starving them to death.
Right. That's so horrible. Thinking about the children that can't get enough food and are going to be suffering permanent damage.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah. I mean, when you have little kids, just how painful it would be for anybody, any family, if you can't feed a small child. They're just be crying constantly. They need nourishment. And if you're thinking about babies, if you're breastfeeding, breastfeeding is so difficult for women to do, even under normal conditions. If you're not having enough food yourself,
Right.
you're not able to produce the milk. Obviously, there's no baby formula. It's just like, and I have little boys, and just thinking just how much work they are, how much attention they need, and if you can't even feed them, just how heartbreaking that is, and this that permanent damage. And it's hard to think of anything more evil than that when you think about, you said 60,000 children maybe already, and who knows how far it's gonna go, and that are going to be suffering all this permanent damage, because they haven't been able to they can't be fed, they can't develop. And then but now I just feel like Israel has done something that is just so horrific, that if aid comes in, if they stop and there's a ceasefire, and then some humanitarian efforts and agencies are allowed to come into Gaza, what they're going to see and witness is just unforgivable. Once it starts to become broadcast to the world, all of a sudden they try to save these children, and how many have gone too far and have died, and they're pulling out all these toddlers out of the rubble, and just these just horrific scenes. Well, like it's like Auschwitz all over again kind of thing when he uncovered. But the thing that's different is that Auschwitz wasn't live streamed to the world. Gaza is. We know that this is happening, and we can see it, and we're letting it happen. And if Israel stops now, just how damning it would be for them, or they continue, and how damning it'll be for them. They've gone too far. It's like, I think it's on what they've done is unforgivable. They cannot get away with it at this point. What are the repercussions? How is this going to play out?
Yeah. Well, I think, before I answer that, I just wanted to comment briefly on that 53,000 dead figure. That's the official tallied death toll of the Gaza war among Gazans. There was that is an undercount. I think there's just no question about it.
Yeah.
First of all, just looking at, we're talking about direct deaths. People that were killed as a result of bombings or, drone attacks, gunfire, and so on. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about all these, indirect deaths, which always happen in war. Recently, The Economist published, it was actually a piece on a Lancet study. Lancet is one of the world's most prestigious medical journals. And they had gone carefully over all the records, and they estimated that the actual, direct death count was anywhere from 50% to, I think, 109% higher than the official count. So they're saying 77,000 to 109,000. Okay, again, this is direct deaths. Now, it was an earlier study that was done, which pointed out, this was not any sort of effort to exaggerate the impact, but this is kind of standard statistical analysis. It's understood that in a war, actually the majority of deaths are not direct deaths, they're indirect deaths. And usually the ratio is somewhere like from 4-to-1 to 15-to-1. Because not only are people killed directly by bombs, but, they, for various reasons, they don't have access to medical care, or it's much more difficult for them to receive needed medical care. They don't have, they have problems, of course, they may not have the regular access to food and water. The drinking water may be contaminated, and all of these things are especially true in Gaza, where there's been a deliberate attacks on medical facilities and on water treatment facilities, and most obvious and cruelest of all is this complete suspension of humanitarian aid. So no medicine, no food, and actually even water was directly cut off. So all those things that contribute to indirect deaths are particularly present in Gaza. So I would think that you would have, they give this 4 to 15. So if you have 100,000 direct deaths, you could have anywhere from 400,000 to 1.5 million. Now, not all those deaths happen immediately, but they can happen over time. And that's, we give you one case is the Iraq War. I think most of the estimates, that the initial analysis came up with maybe 100,000 direct deaths. But later studies, that done 2 years later, found that there was a huge spike in mortality, much above the usual mortality levels in Iraq. And they found excess mortality of something like 1 million. Now that was roughly, it could have been a 10-to-1 ratio in Iraq. What you have to do is, you have to actually look at overall mortality statistics. And I don't think we even have them. It's just things are so chaotic in Gaza right now. But so
Right.
anyway, just what I thought it was important because, this 53,000, that's just no question about it. Again, The Economist is hardly a publication sympathetic to the Palestinians, but they're saying, this is the fact. And the Lancet is very, very prestigious and very, very careful what it says. So anyway, we're looking at that, but then, how are the Israelis going to deal with it? Well, it's clear that there is actually a very large, powerful element in Israel that knows exactly what's going on, and they don't care. They want these people to die. I'll just give you an example. I think it was recently there was some kind of, maybe it was a Knesset meeting or whatever. It was a meeting of some kind, where there was, somebody like an expert was presenting information on deaths in Gaza, and was trying to be actually very, very careful and kind of trying to blame Hamas for it, but saying, we got a real problem here. These kids are starving, and certainly that's something we as Israelis, we don't want the kids to starve. Kids are innocent. Maybe we should kind of reconsider our policies. And there were very angry responses. How dare you bring this up? How dare you say this? You clearly are working for Hamas. It's just like they just made it clear that it didn't matter. He says there's this is a statement that you hear again and again in Israel. There are no innocents in Israel. So even the kids
In Gaza.
Oh yeah, rather in Gaza, exactly. There are no innocents in Gaza. Even the children are guilty. And so we are justified in starving them to death. You do get people saying that. Now, I think that's a minority, but it's just scary that you find it. And some of these people are very powerful. We have Smotrich, the finance minister, and Ben Gvir. They're clearly in that camp. And I would say that Netanyahu is himself. He just knows to be a little bit more clever when talking to Western reporters and careful about what he says. But again, very, very powerful people think this way. Now, I think most Israelis just wouldn't quite say that, but the truth is, I think you have to say they have been complicit, like many, many people in the West. But this is happening. They know that there are these people in charge and that this is taking place. They have to know, that these children are all these Gazans are being starved to death, just a very short distance away from them. And they make them feel kind of uncomfortable at a certain level, but they're complicit. They're not protesting this. What are they protesting? It's the hostages. That's where they're attacking Netanyahu. You're not bringing the 25 live hostages home. Who cares about the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Gazans that are going to die? That you have to say that's the truth. That's the psychology in Israel. And I think again, it's like if you actually commit a crime, sometimes I'm not speaking from direct experience, but just from observing people, whether it's an actual crime or maybe it was a terrible divorce or something like this. The way for somebody maybe who really did something wrong and very, broke up a family unnecessarily, or killed somebody. Sometimes the way of dealing with that is to demonize the victim. So it's just like, oh yeah, he was such a horrible man. I had to do this to him. Um, and I think maybe we're seeing some of that in Israel. It's just like once you go down that road, it's hard. It's really hard to turn back. This is different. We're talking about in Ukraine, of course. It's just like you made this mistake and you had these opportunities to have a peace treaty. You could have saved almost all of Ukraine. You didn't. And then hundreds of thousands of lives are lost, more territory is lost. It's really hard to admit that, right? But here, it's just like you've gone down, you're starving children to death, or you're complicit in that. Well, that's hard to accept too. How do you deal with that? Sometimes the way that you deal with it is that you demonize the victim. You just pretend that they're somehow less than human. And, maybe you might not have, some people already had that tendency, obviously in Israel, and in the West. Let's be obvious. Let's be honest. Many just throughout the West are complicit in this, have allowed themselves to become complicit. But over time, if you're going to hang on to your position, it almost becomes necessary to demonize the victims, including even the children.
Well, if you take that incredibly dark path and a whole country takes that path, that country is doomed, right? You can't have a country that is behaving this way, that is openly engaged in genocide and it spends all of its time justifying it. And when this is all said and done, just from what you're telling me right now, based on The Economist and the Lancet article, we could be looking at half the population of Gaza that has died already, with 70% of those being women and children. So if we start to come afterwards, we say you killed up to 1 million women and children, and for what? What did you accomplish out of this, Israel? This was all about October 7th? You can't do that, right? You can't spin that to the world, and you can't just say that there are no innocents. We see all the footage, and if, like I said, 70% are women and children, that's crazy. This is crazy. Then Israel is doomed, right? It can't. A country that is engaged in that can't survive. It has to radically change or disappear, right?
I think so eventually. I mean, that's, yeah, no, I don't think it can last, but it could last for years and do plenty more damage. That's the sad truth. As long as it has the U.S. at its back, and I think that's just what they're banking on. Even in spite of the friction, which appears to be real between Netanyahu and Trump, it's still, the arms are still flowing. There hasn't been any real talk or threat of cutting off the U.S. support for Israel. And if they have that, they feel invulnerable. And then you have these people that are kind of apocalyptic in their thinking, that are gaining real power within Israel. And, they see this as, this is Israel's great moment to destroy its enemies and to establish greater Israel. And they're going for it. Of course, there are countervailing forces. There are those people who really aren't on board. Let's be honest, there's this, according to at least some polls, 70% of Israelis want a ceasefire and want the hostages returned. And, they're not abandoning their Zionism. They don't really care about the Palestinians, but they don't share the apocalyptic view, I don't think. They've in a way, they've gone along with it. Why have all these settlers been able to, to take so much of the West Bank over the years? They've let these crazies run riot, and now the crazies have real power. They used to be labeled as terrorists. People like Ben Gvir at one time were. He was part of a movement that was labeled a terrorist movement, but now they're in charge, and you have to say, I don't know. It's just you say, okay, well, there is this large part of the population that's really not on board, but they haven't really fought it either, have they? They've let it happen, and maybe they're just like people everywhere. You see that happen. Most people don't really want to think hard about these things. They just want to live normal lives. And then you hear about this, this scary, these awful events, and they notice these dark tendencies, but it's, that means we would really have to get in a real fight with them. And I don't want to deal with that. I just want to draw my salary and go home. But anyway, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's what
Yeah, I don't even remember my question at this point, but that's all right. But do you think that Trump will get aid into Gaza? I mean, it's the situation, the way it seems so desperate right now.
Yeah.
It's like these people will starve. They are starving to death. We are seeing starvation death. And he's saying just how many of these kids have been permanently damaged. It's so horrific. It's so horrible. And, the United States has incredible leverage over Israel.
Right.
We saw it with Witkoff just brokering the ceasefire deal, that we can do it if we wanted to. Witkoff went over there and did it instantly, said, stop it now.
Yeah.
And what happened?
Yeah.
Netanyahu had to snap to attention. So it's like, just do it, Trump. You are overseeing this starvation crisis just as much. You say you want to take care of the situation, one phone call, he can take care of it. Just say, no, this has to end. And then once we go in, if we do go in, I hope we start to save as many people as we can that are on the brink of starvation. But if people start seeing this, like really mainstream, and we find out like, oh my God, hundreds and thousands of women and children have been killed, have been slaughtered or starved to death, crushed under rubble. Just horrific civilian casualties here. Israel, I just don't see Israel being able to get away with it. And you're saying, a lot of even hardcore Zionists are starting to turn, mainstream medias as well. There was always this idea, people like Douglas Murray are always saying how, Israel is the bastion of Western civilization, fighting the hordes out there. We need to protect it. More and more people are saying, like, is this Western civilization? You are protecting us from the barbarians by starving hundreds of thousands of children? Like who's the barbarian here? What is civilization? Well, Israel has given the whole Western world a horrible name because of our complicity and our failure to recognize this. We always talk about wanting to protect minorities and embracing diversity and all these things, but then at the end of the day, it almost feels like we are the core racist kind of civilization, that we're saying that it's okay for us to just allow all these Arabs to die, to kill them. It's fine. They're defending Western civilization by killing them. It's almost what we're saying.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a question there. It's just.
Yeah. No, there's certainly something to what you said. Of course, there are good Arabs, like the kind that give you gifts of 747s, and then there are bad Arabs.
Right. I don't know. We can end it there, I guess, unless there's something else. I don't know. Do you want to mention anything about Iran before we call it a day, or?
No. Why don't we? There's not a whole lot to be said. I think we've said enough today.
Okay. Well. Yeah, fingers crossed for aid to Gaza. It's becoming so desperate, and I just feel kind of helpless.
Right. Well, maybe I'll just add very briefly, because this is what we're talking about. Trump says that the U.S. has some plan to distribute humanitarian aid in southern Gaza, and the reports are, well, obviously he couldn't do that without some sort of coordination from the Israelis, short of invading Israel or something. So it would have to be, supported by the Israelis. And there were reports saying that, they had worked something out. And I think I mentioned it was clear it was part, if indeed it goes through, it's part of an ethnic cleansing plan, meaning that, they're trying to just push every last Gazan out of northern Gaza into a very limited area. They'll just be packed within southern Gaza, and then they'll be provided with some kind of humanitarian aid. It'll be, on the basis of what we heard so far, it would be semi-starvation, but it would keep these people alive in a malnourished state for a while anyway. So that's the plan that's being talked about. But we don't know, if this is actually going to happen. He talks like it's going to happen, but Trump, he often talks about things that aren't real, and we'll just see. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay. Well, thoughts and prayers to the people of Gaza. Okay. All right, Dad. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.